Anyone who's seen previous presentations of mine might be familiar with certain aspects of this, which is titled culture creation, but it's the first time I've weaved them all together into this particular talk, and it's tying together a lot of loose ends and trying to make sense of it. Basically, it's social engineering and mass mind control by any other name, which is what I've studied for the past 15 years or so. To set the tone for what I will be discussing, we can go back to this famous quote from Edward Bernays. Pretty sure I've presented this one before, but it does help to put things into perspective. So Edward Bernays was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, coming out of that particular bloodline family. So he knew a thing or two about how the human psyche operates, and therefore how it can be manipulated and controlled in line with certain agendas. In the opening paragraph to his book, Propaganda, published in 1928, he wrote, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. That dynamic remains as accurate today as when those words were first written almost 100 years ago." I can't talk about mass mind control and social engineering without discussing this particular organisation, and I'm pretty sure I've gone into this one previously as well. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, often abbreviated just as Tavistock. If it has Tavistock in front of it, be wary of it, unless we're talking about the town in Devon. That's why I wear a t-shirt which states Tavistock Resistant, because it's at this place that psychological operations are perfected by behavioural scientists and master psychologists whose full-time jobs it is to work out how the public reaction to certain situations can be shaped and moulded in line with Bernays' operating methods. Would it surprise you to learn, particularly if you've seen any of my previous talks, that Tavistock has some military connections? It was initially established in the time of the First World War. It was known as Wellington House, and it was here that propaganda was perfected to unleash on the British public in line with what was going on with the so-called Great War. This guy had a thing or two to say about Tavistock, and this remains a very important book in conspiracy research. Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300. It was written by Dr. John Coleman, who was a former British military intelligence insider. He worked for MI5. He became a whistleblower, and he started to spill the beans on much of what he had learnt during his years in the intel services. Military intelligence is, of course, an oxymoron. I'll let that one sink in. So, among the various claims that Coleman made were that a particular pop group, which is rather well known all around the world and has been for several decades, was a creation of Tavistock for the purpose of shaping and moulding certain societal attitudes, changing ideas and changing value systems. Tavistock worked very closely with another organisation known as the Frankfurt School, coming out of Germany, and it was here that the idea of cultural Marxism was perfected. It expresses itself these days as what we might call political correctness, or so-called woke culture. These ideas and cultivating these ways of thinking were perfected by the likes of Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas, who were the founding members of Frankfurt. They worked in close conjunction with the social scientists at Tavistock, and over in the United States, the closest thing that they've got to these organisations is Stanford Research Institute. The 1960s counterculture stands as a master study in how culture creation gets done. Professor Willis Harman, who was the Director of Social Policy at the SRI, produced a document known as the Changing Images of Man, which went in line with what was known as the Aquarian Conspiracy in the 1960s. It got its name from the so-called astrological age of Aquarius, which was said to be incoming in the late 1960s, and according to some, we're still waiting for it now. Nobody seems to be able to agree on exactly when the age of Aquarius began, or if it indeed has begun. But it was big news in the mid to late 1960s when all kinds of cultural changes were taking place. This was the so-called counterculture. Hippie flower power ideals were everywhere, and there's so much evidence now to show that that entire scene, that entire movement, all those ideas and all those value systems were cultivated by social engineers working out of these kinds of organisations. So the group which Dr. John Coleman spoke about in his book was, of course, the Beatles. You always get a story to explain where these groups have come from. So when it comes to the Beatles, we're told they're just four regular working class lads from Liverpool. They put together a group at a school fete, and they wrote a few songs, came up with a few catchy guitar riffs and punted around a few demo tapes, got their record deal with EMI, and the rest is history. Ed Sheeran is a busker, don't you know? That's how he got his start. You know, it's nothing to do with the bloodline family that he comes out of, honest. Madonna was penniless and, you know, just turned up in New York, didn't know anyone, hustled around a bit. Just happened to become the biggest pop star, you know, of the past 4 decades. That's the way it works. That's the Cinderella fairy story, and that's what's peddled to kids to make them believe that they too can become as successful, as influential as the Beatles, Ed Sheeran or Madonna. You can't. Not unless you come from the right families or you have the right kind of affiliations, as we'll continue to see. So the Beatles first came out in 1962 with their debut single Love Me Do, and initially they were effectively a boy band singing boy meets girl love songs. She loves you, I want to hold your hand, love me do, songs of this nature. By 1966, midway through their relatively short career, their music, their image, their overall approach, ethos had started to change. Songs such as Tomorrow Never Knows were starting to come through. This was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead as translated by Dr. Timothy Leary, who we'll be getting to. And so Eastern mysticism was starting to creep into the culture. This was in line with changes in rock music, changes in social attitudes to family, to sex, between the different generations. And all of this was being cultivated as a social engineering exercise because the behavioural scientists wanted to change attitudes to all kinds of things. They wanted to change society, change culture, and drive a wedge, very importantly, between the different generations at the time. So the Beatles very much did their job. Here's an image, which you can't see that well, but some of you might be familiar with it, from an album they released, a compilation album, in June of 1966. So it's 666, which, don't know if you've noticed, but it's a number that just happens to crop up rather a lot in this style of research. Crops up all over the place, it turns out. So yesterday and today, and on this album sleeve, we've got the four Beatles in white coats, and they're covered with pieces of raw meat, and there are mutilated baby dolls all over them. So there's severed heads, and there's severed arms and legs and things of this nature. At the time, people were told this was an avant-garde art statement. They were pushing the envelope in line with the standards of the time. But I feel, with the knowledge that we've come to know of these past few years, that there could have been other things being communicated here. But either way, this demonstrates that the Beatles were very much an asset of the controllers of society. They were a group that was put to use whenever an agenda needed pushing. And we've seen that ever since the music industry began. We see celebrities of all kinds, whether it's Hollywood actors, TV stars, anyone in the public spotlight. Whenever there's an agenda that needs propping up, they get called on and the job gets done. So in London in the 1960s, there was another group that was busy pushing the counterculture of the time, the British variant of it. This was Pink Floyd, the initial incarnation of Pink Floyd when they were known as the Pink Floyd, with Syd Barrett still in place as their frontman. So they were residents at a club in London called the UFO Club, and this was pushing the psychedelic culture of the time and all these rock bands that were breaking down the barriers in terms of what rock music was doing at that time. LSD was the drug of choice, and this was everywhere, not just in California, as we'll see, but also in London and elsewhere in Britain. And so the Pink Floyd played their part in pushing that whole culture in line with what was happening in America. So this would have been Stanford Research Institute working in conjunction with Tavistock to make sure all these changes took place. The original frontman of the Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett, had to be kicked out of the group very early on, 1967. The official story is that he fried his brains from doing too much LSD, and he could no longer be relied upon to perform and to write songs. Syd Barrett's father worked in mind control research in laboratories out of Cambridge University with connections to the British government and, by default, Tavistock. So it seems far more likely to me that Syd was used as a test subject in his father's research, probably involving mind-altering drugs such as LSD, and something went desperately wrong, and so he had to be effectively kicked out of the group and replaced by Dave Gilmour. Then a few years down the line, which is so often how it's done, the entire look and the entire fabric of Pink Floyd changed, and they went into their progressive rock phase, for which they're best known, Dark Side of the Moon and all the rest of it. They grew out their hair, changed their image, all in line with changing agendas, because by that point what was achieved in the 1960s was a done deal, and the controllers were ready to move on to the next agenda. Staying with the 60s though, it wasn't just rock bands who were the cultural heroes of that time. They came in all shapes and sizes. And one of them was the consciousness guru, so-called, Dr. Timothy Leary. He's credited with having popularised the mantra of those times, turn on, tune in, drop out. What that meant was that it was encouraging the young people of the time to drop out of organised society, but more specifically to drop out of any kind of political activism, and specifically any kind of opposition to the Vietnam War, which had kicked off big time by this point. Leary's story is that he was a Harvard lecturer, professor, and he was kicked out of his academic role when he started embracing psychedelic culture and encouraging his students to do psychedelics, or entheogens as they were known, and go on these amazing journeys of self-discovery. And many people will say, well, what's so wrong with that? I've had some great times on acid or mushrooms or peyote or whatever it may be. And my answer is always that if that's an individual decision that somebody has made for themselves and it harms no one else, then there's no problem. And I'm sure many people have had incredible experiences on these compounds. The problems begin when this is occurring on somebody else's terms, and when people, almost invariably young people, are being coerced into these kinds of activities by the likes of Leary, Pied Pipers in society. When it's happening on somebody else's terms, and when it fulfills some kind of social engineering agenda of which you don't have full knowledge, that's when the problems can begin. So large numbers of young people in these times were being encouraged to do shitloads of LSD, effectively, in line with changing rock music, psychedelic styles, very trippy sort of experimental styles of rock music, and other kinds of changes that were coming into society. At many of the hippie festivals and the big gatherings in that time, there was a brightly coloured psychedelic bus which would turn up, and it would contain an individual by the name of Ken Kesey. They were known as Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. Kesey was an author. He wrote the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was later made into a movie starring Jack Nicholson. Kesey was also an inmate in one of the MKUltra hospitals coming out of the CIA. All roads, it seems, lead to the CIA. MKUltra was a very far-reaching mind control program that officially ran between 1953 and 1973. We're asked to believe that it was wound up in the 1970s. Yeah, right. It's far more likely that it simply went off the books and became a black operation just hidden away in the shadows, but if anything, the activity would have been stepped up. But Kesey came out of MKUltra, And he would turn up with his associates, the merry pranksters, distributing free tabs of acid, which was coming in seemingly endless supplies. It was no problem. Very few dealers were getting busted, nobody really knew what the supply lines were, but documentation that's come out in recent times has shown that almost all of the LSD that was turning up at these music festivals and such was coming through CIA supply lines. The CIA are the biggest pushers of drugs on the surface of Earth, whatever shape it may be. So, all kinds of cultural heroes. Would it surprise you to learn that Dr. Timothy Leary, in his latter years, admitted in interviews to having been an asset of the CIA? He was on the payroll. He said so himself. Here's another one. Gloria Steinem, credited with being the mother of the modern feminist movement. She was behind Ms. magazine, and she encouraged women during those times to get out of the home and get into the workplace. And the way it was sold to them was, hey sisters, we can do anything our male counterparts do. We don't want to be left behind, do we? We can do the same jobs as them. We can earn the same salaries as them. The real agenda here was breaking up the traditional family unit in recognition of how problematic the cohesion that these units bring to social engineers that want to foment discord in society. They want chaos, they want disruption. So a great way to achieve that is to get women to put their children into state so-called care at ever earlier ages so the indoctrination can begin, and get these women into the workplace where they've broken up the family home and now they're contributing even more taxation to the IRS. So it's a win-win if you're a satanic psychopath. And so that's what was going on in the 1960s. And it turns out that Gloria Steinem was another asset of the CIA, undertaking various undercover missions for them. A band which was very popular in those times, pretty much the house band for the whole sort of hippie flower power thing, was the Grateful Dead. And connections when it comes to the personnel behind this group do not disappoint. We've got direct affiliations with Freemasonry, with Harvard and Yale universities, with aristocratic bloodline families going back many generations, and through group member Bob Weir, we have a direct connection to Bohemian Grove, because he's admitted, somewhat reluctantly, in interviews to having been in attendance at these meetings at Bohemian Grove, this very strange place where the rich and powerful and influential in society meet once a year in the summer in this area of Redland Forest, dress up in robes, gather in front of this 40-foot stone owl and take part in this ritual known as the cremation of care, dancing around a large bonfire. You know, we've all done it, it's a standard weekend. This fella circles us right back round to Tavistock. So we have a direct link from the Grateful Dead back to where social engineering was perfected on these shores. Meet Eric Trist. Here's his wiki biog. We learn that he was born on the 11th of September, interesting date, and we're told that he just happens to have been one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute of Social Sciences in London. Why is that relevant? Well, meet his son. This is Alan Trist, and he worked for a time as the music publisher and the road manager for the aforementioned Grateful Dead. So now we've got a direct link between this group and this organisation. A previous road manager for the Grateful Dead was a guy by the name of Hank Harrison, who, as well as being the biological father of Courtney Love and having accused his own daughter of having been complicit in the murder of Kurt Cobain, because that's what really went on there, also turns out to have been on the books at the CIA, on the payroll. Glad you're all sitting down to recover from the shock. This is a story often told, but it reinforces the point, so it bears retelling. Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors. This group were very much the poster children for that anti-establishment, anti-war angst that was being felt among the youthful generation of the time, the generation known as the baby boomers. So Jim's up there as the front man of this group, and he's getting naked and he's doing alcohol and he's doing drugs and he's encouraging all these young people to go against their parents' value system and just engage in sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyles. Meanwhile, meet Jim's old man. Here he is on the right. This is Admiral George Stephen Morrison, and he turns out to have been the Navy Admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which was used to justify America's involvement or escalation in the very bloody and protracted Vietnam War. So how do we reconcile these two factors? Jim Morrison, the poster child for the anti-war generation, and his old man having effectively started the Vietnam War. This is hell.
But will the university be ready to meet his ambitions? Will his parents have been sufficiently interested in his future to have concerned themselves with the needs of their universities?
We regret to inform you that we are unable to accept your application to...
So what we were looking at there is a young James Douglas Morrison, 1964, in an acting gig, because he was effectively an actor. This is what we find so often with the sons and daughters of high-ranking military personnel, those from tried and tested families. They get put to use in these roles, just like Syd Barrett in Pink Floyd, by virtue of the work that his old man did. So Jim Morrison was an actor. That was an ad for Florida State University in 1964. By the following year, 65, he'd grown out his hair, lost his shirt, and become the front man of the Doors. And this group just emerged out of nowhere with hundreds of songs already written, a band already formed and ready to go. And by the way, the other members of the Doors also have family connections through their dads into the world of the military. And this is a dynamic we find time and time again when it comes to rock musicians and bands, particularly those that emerged out of the 1960s so-called counterculture. Endless connections through the fathers into expressions of the military intelligence or other government operations. None of it was organic, or if it ever started out that way, it was very quickly infiltrated and steered off in certain desired directions because of the amazing potential that popular culture and entertainment has for mass mind controlling large numbers of people and getting ideas and value systems embedded into the minds of large numbers of people. Here's another organisation that specialises in that, the London School of Economics. So rather similar to Tavistock, this place cultivates those that will go out into society and have large influence. Most graduates of the LSE go on to careers in law, business, finance, these kinds of things. What you don't expect is graduates to become grizzled, debaucherous, hedonistic, drug-addled old rock stars. But it didn't stop Mick Jagger. Because Mick Jagger studied at the LSE and then came out as frontman of the Rolling Stones, and we all know the rest. Right from the start, he was pushing agendas along with his group. In this slide, we have a still from the video to the Rolling Stones song Sympathy for the Devil, and Mick's rocking lipstick and eyeshadow. So the agenda to blur the lines between the genders, androgyny, was already beginning in the late 1960s, and Mick was their man to kickstart that whole thing. This is before David Bowie and all the glam rockers were doing it, Brian Ferry and all the rest in the early 70s. It was an agenda. It was incoming. More of the same in the cult movie Performance. It was just androgyny all the way. The Rolling Stones are pictured here on the cover of their album Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Catchy title, huh? This was released 6 months after the Beatles' landmark Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That album was released right at the start of June of 1967, which was known at the time as the Summer of Love. This was a tag that was given by the media of the time, and it indicated that major changes were afoot. The Beatles were their guys for the job. So 6 months down the line, the Rolling Stones release a psychedelic-styled album, And they're pictured on the cover in a sort of homage or a pastiche of Sergeant Pepper, and cleverly embedded within the sleeve design here, which is a take on the famous Peter Blake design on Sergeant Pepper, you've got the faces of the 4 Beatles. You've got to know where to look, but they're right there when you do. And what this indicates is that both these groups were controlled by the same forces. According to Dr. John Coleman, both of them were ultimately controlled by Tavistock. So it was a dialectic, and it didn't really matter which group the young people of the time gravitated towards. So there were many for whom the Beatles were a little too soft, a little too nice. They liked their rock music a bit more edgy, a bit more dangerous. Well then, the bad boys of rock were there for them. Yeah, they've been so bad and so rebellious these past few years that they've stood up and made all these statements and pushed back against tyranny and... Oh no, they haven't, have they? In fact, none of them have. Not a single one, apart from Right Said Fred. It's a pretty sorry state of affairs. This is how we can know that all these images of the bad boys of rock and rebels, and they're a bit dangerous, a bit edgy, well, they're not really that dangerous, are they? Because they were very quick to encourage everyone to go out and get what the sheep farm lads describe as an arm spear or a 3-dart finish whenever that phone call came in. So that's the true nature of the Rolling Stones. It's a bit like it not making a difference whether you vote Conservative or Labour, or Democrat or Republican, because either way the government gets in and the agendas continue. So it doesn't really matter which group you gravitate towards, the social engineers still have their way at the end of the day. This is a very controversial one. So as we come to the end of the 1960s, there were a few events which put the final nails in the coffin of all those hippie ideals of love and peace and this ethos that was embodied by the whole hippie movement, at least on the surface. So one of them was the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont Racetrack in California in December of 1969, where 4 people died at that event, including one 18-year-old who was stabbed to death by Hell's Angels, who'd been recruited to do the security, so that went well then, at the Rolling Stones performance. Another event was the so-called Tate LaBianca murders, sometimes known as the Tate Manson murders. So the official story here is that there was this guy, Charlie Manson, and he was a bit crazy, and he had this cult, these disciples, these runaway, mainly girls, that gravitated towards his group, and they were all crazy. And one fateful night in August 1969, he coerced 4 of his followers to go up into the Hollywood Hills to the home of the actress Sharon Tate, who was the wife of the film director Roman Polanski, who'd been behind the movie Rosemary's Baby, released the previous year, 1968, and murder them all in a horrific, brutal fashion. And we're told that the same group the following night, 9th of August 1969, went up to another house in the Hollywood Hills and murdered a couple, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. The reason I say this is contentious and controversial is because I presented a talk at the Questioning History conference in March in Slough, drawing on the work of a researcher named Miles Mathis. How many people here are familiar with the work of Miles Mathis? 1. Okay. You got some homework to do. So this guy has a website, milesmathis.com, and he's a painter, not a painter and decorator, but an artist as a day job, but he researches stuff in his spare time, so we're told. There's a lot of question marks about him. Many people feel that it's just not possible for one individual to have produced the amount of work that this guy is said to have done. And it has to be a team working on these various papers that he's put out. But he challenges the official narratives on many world events. So, for instance, he doesn't accept that John F. Kennedy died in November 1963, as we're told he did. He maintains that that whole event was a hoax, it was an acting job, and Kennedy was in on it. He also maintains that John Lennon didn't die when we're told he did. And one of his other contentions is that the Tate Manson murders, so-called, were staged. They were fake. They were a hoax. And whilst I certainly don't agree with everything he maintains about these various events, having looked at the evidence that he presents for this particular one, I have to say that I concur. That these murders never happened. Sharon Tate was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate, another high-ranking military official. She was also an actress and the wife of a Hollywood director. And these murders took place up there in the Hollywood Hills, directly above all these major film studios, where there was ready access to extras, film props, and plenty of fake blood. Mathis makes a very compelling argument for why that event cannot have happened the way we're told it did. He presents photographic evidence where so-called dead bodies have moved position. Sharon seems to be smiling in certain photographs where she's supposed to be dead. There's all kinds of reasons to suspect that this event did not go off the way we're told it did. And in some ways, that's kind of reassuring because it was an event that was used to scare the bejesus out of the American public and completely traumatise a generation. The trial was televised for months on end, so all the grisly details that are supposed to have gone down at this event were kept in the minds of the American public for a very long period. And that was the idea. It was to present the idea to Middle America that hippies, embodied by Charles Manson and his crazy, dangerous followers, were all these crazy, murderous, drug-addled maniacs, and that whole scene had to be put to bed. The social engineers felt that they'd changed societal attitudes adequately by that point, and they didn't need this whole psyop to continue any further. So they themselves destroyed it, and this event was used to help bring that about. Meanwhile, they simply moved on to other agendas. I learned a lot about the science of culture creation and how it ties into social engineering and the concept of lifetime actors from Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill, who used to have a great podcast series on Gnostic media, which became Logos Media. It was called Unspun, and they really got into all this stuff. They did many shows on 1960s rock music and how it tied into the counterculture, MK Ultra, the LSD being everywhere. And Joe Atwill is credited with having popularised the term lifetime actor. This is someone who's in the public eye, so you've heard of them. They're a household name. They might be a Hollywood actor, they might be a musician, might be a television presenter, politician, celebrity chef, supermodel. Anyone whose name is familiar to the point that you could go out there on the streets and wherever I present this talk, I say it would work here. So I did this presentation in America last month. I did 3 gigs out there, Boston, Philadelphia, New Haven. And in each case, I could say you could go out on the streets of Boston, streets of New Haven. I could do this talk in Hastings and say you could go out on the streets there. If you stop 10 people at random and you say, have you heard of, insert name here. Might be Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Elton John. With names like that, you ask 10 people, what do you think you're going to score? 10 out of 10? I would say so. So if you're going to score a 10 out of 10, that's a lifetime actor. That's somebody who's had that career gifted to them by those that can make these things happen. Because you cannot get to that kind of status and that level of influence without it being provided for you. You can't work your way up to that kind of position. Not that you'd want to, it turns out, when you realise what these people are into and what these institutions are all about. But Atwill made the point that anyone in the public eye, to that degree, is a lifetime actor. And you might think of them as a television presenter or a musician, but what they're really there to do is to push agendas and change ideas on certain things. So, by way of an example, take Bill Gates. No, please, take Bill Gates. So, as I'm sure many of us know, when we look into Bill Gates' family background, we discover some interesting things. So, to the average punter on the street out there, Bill Gates is a philanthropist. I know. But this is the public image of him that's been sold. This nerdy computer geek, that has just got a big heart. He cares. He cares so much that he gives away billions of his own money in projects to help people. He just wants to help people. Those poor starving kids in Africa that he, vaccinates, he cares. Just wants to, keep them safe. That's the public image. Bill Gates' father, William H. Gates Sr., was a founding member of Planned Parenthood, which sounds very noble on the surface, but it's actually a eugenics operation concerned with removing certain unwanted aspects of society from the gene pool. So Bill Gates' dad worked alongside the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, and among her various quotes that she made, giving an insight into the way she viewed certain sectors of society, she said, "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." And she described as human weeds, reckless breeders spawning human beings who should never have been born, in describing immigrants and the working class. Nice lady. So Bill Gates' dad would have embodied that kind of value system, so it's a fairly safe bet that this would have been passed on to young Bill himself. Meanwhile, Bill emerges as the head of the worldwide push to get an arm spear into every man, woman and child on Earth, and yet at the same time talks of wanting to reduce the population significantly. What could possibly go wrong? Great example of a lifetime actor. These people are shuffled into these positions so that they build up a fan base. Believe it or not, there's actually fans of Bill Gates. Hard to believe, I know. And they will actually hang on his every word. So they really believe that he invented Microsoft in his garage and he's just this regular nerdy guy, and his world just took off from there because that's the way it happens, don't you know? Meanwhile, he just becomes a philanthropist and starts caring about all these agendas that he gets behind. And people will follow him in those. So when he says we should be doing this, we should be doing that, people will actually listen to what he has to say. That's the way it gets done. I'll go through this one quickly. I sometimes play an audio clip at this point, but I think the audio is a bit difficult to hear, so I'll just tell you what this lady had to say. Her name was Anne Diamond, not the TV presenter, a different one, and I interviewed her a couple of years ago now. She claims to have been inducted into the CIA's MKUltra mind control experimentation program. She says that she was at Allen Memorial at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. This is where some of the most notorious MKUltra experimentation took place, under the directorship of a vicious psychopath by the name of Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. He was Scottish, can you tell? So, various methods were used on the predominantly children that were involved in these experiments. Electroshock treatment, mind-altering drugs, not least LSD, and sensory deprivation were common factors. And Anne Diamond says that she was involved in all of those. She says that she recalls in childhood a young, pre-fame Mick Jagger being present right there at McGill. She says in those days he was known just as Michael. In the interview, she also spoke about Leonard Cohen, the singer-songwriter who became a bit of a folk hero during the 60s counterculture. And she says that she was in a relationship with him for some 20 years. She says that as well as being a performer, he also doubled as a spy. So this is another thing we often find, connections between entertainment and the world of espionage. And she says that him being a singer, songwriter, performer was a cover for him being able to travel around various parts of the world and undertake spying missions on behalf of his paymasters, the CIA and Mossad. She says that Leonard had a habit of cropping up in various parts of the world where famous rock musicians were about to meet their end. So in September 1970, Leonard popped up in London a few days before Jimi Hendrix was murdered at the hands of his manager, because that's what happened to him. We're told he choked on some barbiturates, same way we're told Mama Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas died when she choked on a cheese sandwich. Yeah, I'm sure we're all buying that one. Actually, Hendrix was killed at the behest of his manager, Michael Jeffrey, who turns out to have been an asset of British military intelligence. Leonard then left town a few days after that event. And Diamond says that 10 years later, he popped back up in New York in December of 1980, a few days before John Lennon was assassinated outside the Dakota building. That's if you don't accept Miles Mathis's account that that event never happened, which personally I don't. And then, she says, Leonard took off and holed himself up on a remote Greek island for several months. Interesting interview. You can get that on all my platforms. She also spoke about how various methods were being perfected at McGill University and many of these other MKUltra hospitals to use rock music as a vector for mental illness. She said various techniques were being used to cultivate mental illness in the listeners to much of this stuff that was getting put out. It was by use of sound frequencies and various production methods and other things that were going into the recordings. But it makes sense of a lot. Is Rick Stein related to Judge Jules? This Metro article asks. So what we have here is a very well-known dance music DJ, Judge Jules, who was very instrumental in the acid house rave scene in the UK in its early days, late 1980s. And the celebrity chef, who never seems to be off the BBC, Rick Stein. So it turns out they are related. Rick Stein is Judge Jules's uncle. This gives us a good glimpse into family dynamics that often crop up when it comes to famous people. Certain families are shuffled into influential positions. So a very influential DJ who was on Radio 1, BBC Radio 1 for many years, by the way, another BBC asset, and a very influential celebrity chef. Turns out that Jules himself is another graduate of the London School of Economics, so he came out of that place and then he became a club and radio DJ pushing club culture, rave culture, ecstasy culture, because that was the drug of choice in those times. And this leads us to another, what I suspect to be, social engineering psyop. And this is one which is very close to my past, because although I wasn't a DJ on the scene in these times, I was very much caught up in the culture. Late 1980s, the acid house scene kicked off. It laid the foundations for rave culture in the UK, and that paved the way for the explosion in electronic dance music, which not only went on to take over the whole of the UK, but got exported all around the rest of the world. I suspect this very much to have been a Tavistock-style, military-grade social engineering psyop. I go into this one in great detail in my Musical Truth Volume 2 book, which I put out in 2018, and I still stand by all the assertions that I made there about this whole scene representing a reboot of what went on in the 1960s. The media of the time even referred to it as the second summer of love, talking about the summers of 1988 and 89. So they themselves were drawing the parallels, the connections between what went on in the first summer of love, 1967, and what was happening on British shores in the late 1980s. So many of the familiar elements were there. Instead of LSD, this time around you had a different mind-altering drug, ecstasy, MDMA, which was appearing in seemingly unending quantities. All roads would appear to lead back to British military intelligence, who were putting this stuff out there. Very few drug barons were getting busted for distributing this stuff. A few low-level dealers, but no real big raids, That's because it was coming through official governmental supply lines. Changing music, electronic dance music, replacing what had been there previously. And another common factor was the togetherness, the unity, which came from the raves, the warehouse parties, these gatherings, and eventually it got driven indoors into the super clubs. By the time you got brands like Ministry of Sound, Ministry, as in government department, right? A lot of connections between that operation actually and expressions of the government. The first big super club in London, which remains to this day, and then other big brands such as Cream, Gatecrasher and all these other super clubs which came along in the 1990s. The foundations for all of that were laid in the 1980s. Key DJs like Judge Jules doing his bit. Carl Cox was a major figure on the early rave scene. More recently, he's popped up, encouraging clubbers and festival goers to go out and get a 3-dart finish. Well, he would, wouldn't he? Because he's had a manufactured career gifted to him, and these come at a price. You don't get careers like that for free. This particular scene came with its own emblem as well, an icon, a motif, the smiley yellow face. It appeared very innocent, and the cover story for it, when it cropped up in that late 80s scene, was that it represented the happiness that that scene brought about, not least through all the ecstasy that the kids were popping at these raves, making them very happy and bringing about this loved up vibe. But more recently, that icon seems to have taken on a rather more dark and sinister twist. So a few months ago, we got the news that the Friends actor Matthew Perry had turned up dead in a jacuzzi. Death by bathtub. There's a lot of it around when it comes to celebrities, it seems. Many suspicious elements to that story. Not least that a few days before he turned up dead, he had made a post on social media where he'd pictured himself with one of these smiley yellow faces in the form of a cushion. Gets darker still. A few months ago, this record was released. It came from DJ Pierre, who's one of the original American acid house producers. In 1987, he put out a track simply titled Acid Tracks. This remake, which appeared in 2023, was done in conjunction with a German DJ and producer by the name of Paul van Dyk. Van Dyk bears all the hallmarks of being connected to intelligence operations, but the emblem which accompanied this release was a smiley yellow face but with paint dripping off it, so taking on a bit of a sinister air, and also 2 very distinctive slits in the place of the eyes. And this made me think of something, which was the logo that was used by the Schutzstaffel, the SS, in Nazi Germany during the Second World War years. So we've got a German DJ and producer getting behind an icon, a motif, which incorporates the SS logo. Should we be concerned? Here's another sigil, which has been employed by Paul van Dyk. You're probably going to struggle to see it, but it's a kind of inverted pyramid with 2 corners cut out. And this appeared on artwork that he used on album covers and tour flyers and things like that. This made me think of something as well, which was a logo that I'd seen for British military intelligence, so MI5 once again, and this logo was used between the 1950s and the 1970s. When you invert it, you find that it becomes rather similar to the logo that Van Dyk is using. So it's an inverted pyramid with a sort of capstone at the bottom, and the corners are cut out in a very similar fashion. When it comes to culture creation, it seems that no scene, no genre, no style is left untouched. I used to be a big fan of rap and hip-hop culture. Back in the days when it still made sense, before it became as toxified as it currently is. It's not even worthy of being described as hip-hop anymore. But, the 80s, the 90s, the golden years, when that scene really flourished. What I loved about it as a DJ playing these sounds on radio and in the clubs was that it came with a whole lifestyle and culture. It wasn't just the music, it was other elements. There was the breakdancing, the graffiti, the turntablism. And when you're somebody that shows a love for that culture, you're entrained to think of 3 figures in particular as having been the founding fathers of it all. So one is a DJ by the name of Kool Herc, who came out of a Jamaican family, and he is credited with having invented the concept of the original hip-hop block party. So on the streets and in the parks of the South Bronx, where this culture emerged, from 1973, so we've just passed the 50-year anniversary, Kool Herc would set up sound systems in the Jamaican fashion and style and hold these parties, and the kids from the neighbourhood would come out and dance to these records that he would play, and so the idea of the very first rap and hip-hop parties were born. Then you had Grandmaster Flash, who is credited with inventing the art of turntablism. This is using turntables as musical instruments, scratching and cutting and carving out rhythms on records and treating the turntables like musical instruments. The third founding father of hip-hop culture is this guy, Africa Bambaataa, as he was known. His real name, for many years, was said to be Kevin Donovan. An investigative journalist by the name of Layla Wills from the Metropolis newspaper in Chicago did some digging into this guy a few years ago, and she discovered that actually his real name is Lance Taylor. And when she revealed that information, miraculously his Wikipedia entry changed overnight to reflect the new information. Very little is known really about this guy and where he came from. He's said to have come out of gang culture in the Bronx, New York, an organisation known as the Black Spades, which kind of morphed into the Bronx River Organisation, also simply known as the Organisation. And out of that, Bambaataa formed what he referred to as the Universal Zulu Nation. On the surface, this seemed to be an affiliate sort of group for people who were into hip-hop culture to join forces and link with each other and connect all over the world. In more recent times, it started to smack more of having been a sort of mind control cult. In 2016, two men came out and accused Bambaataa of having sexually molested them when they were minors, teenagers, and members of the Universal Zulu Nation. This is going back to the 1980s. In the wake of that, several other men came forward and also accused Bambaataa of sexual molestation. Layla Wills, that journalist, began a documentary film looking into these accusations against Bambaataa. One guy that she interviewed, TC Islam, who was previously a member of the Universal Zulu Nation, came out and said that it was kind of a best kept secret within the organisation that this is what Bambaataa was up to, but you just knew to kind of say nothing and keep your mouth shut. Does it remind you of anything? Have we heard anything like that before? Jimmy Savile on the BBC, for example. TC Islam, before that documentary could be released, got shot dead in broad daylight on the streets of Atlanta. It's now 2024, 8 years on from those allegations first emerging, and Africa Bambaataa remains a free man, no charges brought against him, nothing's come of those accusations, leading one to suspect that he has high-level protection from certain important sources. I also got to thinking about the naming of some of these cultural heroes coming out of rap and hip-hop. Grand Master Flash, Grand Wizard Theodore. So mentions of Grand Masters makes me think of Freemasonry, for example. Maybe it's just my suspicious mind. Maybe I've been doing this job too long. I don't know. Grand Wizard sounds like something out the bloody Ku Klux Klan to me. So it's causing me to question the origins of this entire art form now, going all the way back to its early days. Was this another psyop? Was that whole scene concocted by social engineers? In more recent times, it's been pushing obvious agendas. There was the gangster rap era, so-called, the glorification of criminal lifestyles through the music. I got caught up in all that stuff. I used to love those records. I used to play them. I was steeped in spiritual ignorance. I couldn't see a social engineering agenda if it stood in front of me and smacked me about the head with a baseball bat, screaming, "I am a social engineering agenda." I know a bit different these days, but back then I was caught up in the whole thing. So rap music has certainly been used to push many agendas, materialism, sexual sort of agendas, criminal lifestyle agendas, And a lot of that is coming to light through what we're now hearing about this individual, Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, P. Diddley, P. Dodie, whatever the hell he's calling himself this week. So he was an entrepreneur in the hip-hop game going all the way back to the early 90s. He was behind Bad Boy Records, a label which emerged out of Arista under the directorship ultimately of Clive Davis, an individual that I mentioned in my Nostalgia Side talk and his connections to Whitney Houston. So Puff Daddy Sean Combs was given his own record label, Bad Boy, and this helped to push, to start with, sort of gangster criminal lifestyles, not least through the notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, who ended up getting murdered on 9th of March 1997, 6 months after Tupac, the rapper, was also murdered in a drive-by shooting in the so-called East Coast-West Coast rap wars. I can see all of that now as yet another agenda used to fulfill certain desired outcomes, but Puff Daddy Diddley was right there at the forefront of so much of that. And in recent times we've had many women and men coming forward with accusations about what he gets up to in his spare time. His former so-called girlfriend, the singer Cassie, launched a legal case against him in November, accusing him of rape, of battery, of assault, of forcibly drugging her, of sexually trafficking her to various other men, and so many other things. And this opened the floodgates for so many other people to file similar accusations at P. Diddy. So if this guy stays out of jail, it will be a friggin' miracle, or it will be a surefire indicator that he has high-level protection. So much is coming out about him, and this story, it seems, is going to run and run for some time yet. It's very similar to what we heard about R. Kelly, the R&B singer, going back a couple of years. He was accused of effectively running a sex cult, a harem, mind control cult. Many women coming forward with accusations about, sexual impropriety towards them. R. Kelly got jailed. So it seems that all celebrity assets are equal, but some celebrity assets are more equal than others, to paraphrase George Orwell. So they don't mind throwing some of them under the bus to give the impression that something is being done, but others seem to stay out of jail and stay out of trouble the whole way. Speaking of whom, how about Tim Westwood? DJ, arguably the most prominent and influential rap and hip-hop DJ in Britain over the past 4 decades. This is a guy that I used to look up to in my formative years as a DJ. He used to have credibility back in the 90s when he was on Capital Radio with the Capital Rap Show. I used to aspire to want to be like this guy. He got me into this kind of music. What I didn't realise at the time is that he is basically just another lifetime actor. So here's his dad, the Reverend William Westwood, Bishop Bill, as he was known. He's an Anglican bishop, or was. He was best known as the Bishop of Peterborough, and his son, Tim, was named after him, Timothy William Westwood. He's a posh boy. He went to public school in Norwich, and he comes from a very wealthy, privileged family. But he positioned himself in the hip-hop game as coming from the streets and, coming with that kind of credibility and talking with this street lingo and stuff, because his job was as gatekeeper for the British hip-hop scene. The social engineers wanted one of their own in place in the most prominent position in that music genre. And so they opted for a posh white public schoolboy to do the job. Similar dynamic when it comes to reggae music in Britain, because the most influential and prominent DJ there for quite a few decades has been David Rodigan, MBE. Highly respected by reggae fans, but with a rather dubious background. So, military family. His father was a military man. He was born on a military base in Hanover, Germany. He was a trained actor, went to stage school, appeared in certain episodes of the BBC's Doctor Who, among various other things. And then he just happened to get shuffled into place as the most prominent DJ on the reggae scene. So, in other words, he's the gatekeeper for that whole culture. And what do you notice about these two scenes? We've got posh white public schoolboys in influential positions in black cultures, black forms of music. So the controllers couldn't have black DJs rising to those influential positions. They wanted representatives of their class in place in these prominent roles. And a third gatekeeper would be Pete Tong, MBE, who has been an asset of the BBC for some, what is it now, 33, what's in a number? 33 years he's held a show on BBC Radio 1. He's known as the sort of godfather of electronic dance music in Britain, and he even describes himself on his own social media as the Pied Piper of dance. What did the Pied Piper of legend do? He led all the young people from a particular town, the children, astray, away from their parents and off to their doom by the use of music. So he's basically telling you what he's doing. A gatekeeper by any other name. And these are all people that I used to look up to. As a DJ myself, you know, these used to be inspirations to me. These used to be role models, and I've had to let them all go. And we all do if we're going to face up to the truth of who these people really are. And if we stand on the side of truth and freedom and sovereignty and all these other values that we embody, then you have to let so many of these cultural heroes go, because you realise that you've not chosen them. They've been chosen for you. And it's the same with any fad, any trend, any scene, any movement. As Karen said at the start, I don't discriminate, I piss everyone off. So whatever music genre you're into, I'll get to yours eventually, just give me time. And so it was with the new romantic scene, at least in those days though, you know, the post-punk scene coming out of the 70s, going into the 80s, at least you had scenes, right? You know, there was two-tone and ska, and there was new wave, and there was new romantics and synth pop. At least you had scenes. What have you got in the 2020s for Gen Z? Are there any scenes anymore? It just seems to be one big sort of homogenized splodge, just this mess of nothingness. And it's either really insipid and really bland, or it's deeply toxic and satanic. It's one thing or the other. And that's music and popular culture these days. We don't have scenes anymore. They've done away with all of that. At least it used to be interesting to study this stuff. This is why I don't bother looking at contemporary, current, so-called music, because it doesn't interest me. At least it was interesting to look into these bands. They were interesting characters with compelling stories. So this was the case with the new romantic scene, and so often we find that there are venues associated with certain movements, not just the bands and the familiar faces, but places where these young people would hang out. With the New Romantics, it was all about this club in Covent Garden, London, called the Blitz Club. So in this picture we've got Steve Strange at the centre. He was part of the group Visage alongside Midge Ure, also out of Ultravox, who's also in this picture. And Steve Strange is yet another music guy with a military father who died at a relatively young age in very suspicious circumstances. There are many other stories like it. Out of that new romantic scene, we had arguably the most influential band of the very early 80s, Adam and the Ants. And a study into Stuart Goddard, aka Adam Ant, doesn't disappoint either. All the familiar elements are there. So his father was in the military, in the army. His father was also exposed as having been part of a grotesque paedophile ring with affiliations to Jimmy Savile. Adam Ant, we're told, suffers from bipolar disorder, and this is used to explain away some of his plain bizarre behaviours in public. To my thinking, it's far more consistent with him having been involved in MK Ultra-style trauma-based mind control. Where you find expressions of the military on all this other unsavoury stuff, you often find direct connections into the world of mind control. They go hand in hand. And again, it's the offspring of these military personnel who were often used in experimentation programs. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's what we've really been looking at when it comes to Adam Ant, who, by the way, is still out there touring and doing shows even now, into his 60s. It seems a lifetime actor's work is never done. Just ask Noel Gallagher. So, as I said, when there's an agenda to be cropped up, and when you are a lifetime actor on the payroll, you don't get to say no. I strongly suspect the whole Cool Britannia thing in the mid-90s of being yet another social engineering psyop. And I feel that that whole thing was all about making Tony Blair and his new Labour Party palatable to the young people of the time, as amazing as that now sounds in retrospect. So in the mid-90s, a great many young people who should have known better fell for the image that was being put forward of Blair as this cool guy, in touch with the youthful population, in touch with Britain, and used to be in a band himself, played a bit of guitar, smoked a few spliffs, he's cool, he's a cool guy, man, he's down with the kids, And so Noel Gallagher's there at number 10 at a champagne reception, and he's helping to push this whole idea, this whole image of Blair as this dynamic, visionary young leader. They wanted Tony Blair in office in 1997. That election took place on Beltane morning, 1st of May, so occult significance to the date, so that he was in office ready to preside over the ritual murder of Princess Diana, which occurred later that summer. Then he got ushered into office for a second term in 2001, so that he was in place ready to preside over the events of 9/11. And then he got a third term in office in 2005, ready to preside over the events of 7/7 in London. Blair was their man for the job, and the whole Cool Britannia bollocks, in the words of George Michael, that's how he described it, was used to get him in ready for all of this. We know a bit different now when it comes to the true nature of Tony Blair, or Miranda, as he is at the weekends. A murderous psychopath. And still pushing agendas to this day, still popping up as a talking head, whenever there's something to be pushed. At this stage, when I do this talk as a two-parter, I normally take a break at this point, and I give the final word to the late, great George Carlin, who can sum up everything I've spoken about over the past hour with this simple phrase.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
If you didn't hear, he said, it's a big club, and you ain't in it. And neither would you want to be either. So, welcome back, says Jimmy. And so we press on. And at this point, I want to go into the punk and new wave scene. Why should we leave them out, eh? So we've covered dance music and hip-hop and the 60s psychedelic stuff. Let's move into punk now. And a good place to start, which was raised in one of the Unspun podcasts by Atwill and Irvin, is the naming of the punk genre in the first place. We ought to be able to glean something from the etymology of it, right? Get a few clues. So when it comes to the Grateful Dead, who I mentioned in the first part, fans of that group were often referred to as deadheads, and they thought it was a term of endearment. What they didn't realise is that the phrase deadhead was used in morbid satanic mockery of them by their overlords, by those who created that group. That's the way they see the masses, and they lump the likes of us in with the other folk on the street out there. They see us all as spiritually profane and ignorant, and to be mocked to our faces, to be called deadheads. And we get the same thing with the word punk. So various definitions of the word punk include a young man used as a homosexual partner, especially in prison. It's a good start. An aggressive and violent young man. An inexperienced young person. A cowardly or weak young man. An inferior, rotten, worthless person or thing. a petty criminal or hoodlum. Got any punks in the house? Probably not at this point. The cultural heroes of the original punk rockers from the 1970s were said to have been the beat poets who emerged out of the 1950s. They were also lauded as cultural heroes of the 60s generation as well. And they included Allen Ginsberg. Nice man, he was. He was a member of the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which, if you can't guess from the title, campaigns for adult males to be able to have sexual relations with young boys without penalty. So yeah, some cultural hero, right? As I said, certain locations figure in the history of certain music genres, and when it comes to the New York variant of punk rock in the 1970s, it was very much centred around Chelsea, the Chelsea district of Manhattan, and in particular the Chelsea Hotel. This is a place with a very dubious history. Many strange things have taken place here, and for some reason, many musicians and novelists and film directors and playwrights and poets have holed themselves up at the Chelsea Hotel for long periods. There are rumours of it also acting as an MK-Ultra CIA stronghold. There are rumours of satanic rituals having taken place in its basement. And it's also where Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols is said to have stabbed to death his girlfriend Nancy Spungen at the ripe old age of 20 on the 12th of October, Aleister Crowley's birthday, just a coincidence, in 1978. So, very strange place. When Elvis Costello sang "I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea," he's probably talking about this place. Interestingly, Chelsea is also the part of London around which the British variant of the punk scene really got moving in the mid-1970s. And that occurred at the hands of this pair, Malcolm McLaren and his partner, Vivian Westwood. No relation to Tim, at least not as far as I know, though it wouldn't surprise me. So between them, they ran a boutique, a shop in the King's Road, Chelsea, called Sex. And it was out of this place that the Sex Pistols were born. So here's Malcolm with his Cambridge Rapist t-shirt. Catchy, huh? Nice slogan. And Vivian has got a picture of a young, naked male child. So lovely couple. Out of that shop, we're told the Sex Pistols were patched together in much the same way as any given boy band would be. Principal members being Sid Vicious, who took over as bassist from Glenn Matlock, real name John Simon Ritchie. And he's so punk rock that his parents met when they both served in the British Royal Air Force. Punk rock, right? And his father also worked as a Beefeater guardsman at Buckingham Palace. Johnny Rotten, meanwhile, John Lydon, wrote in his autobiography, Anger is an Energy, that just prior to finding fame with the Sex Pistols, he used to attend kinky late-night sex parties at the House of Commons, where he saw various prominent MPs in compromising positions with call girls and rent boys. What he doesn't adequately explain is what he himself was doing there in the first place. The Clash were pitched as the Sex Pistols' rivals, it says here. This is Joe Strummer, real name John Graham Mellor. He was the son of Ronald Mellor, OBE, who was a civil servant attached to the Foreign Office in the British government. So, yeah, again, punk rock, rebels, anarchists. The other prominent member of The Clash, who also went on to Big Audio Dynamite, was Mick Jones. Why is he pictured side by side with Grant Shapps, the former Transport Secretary in Boris Johnson's cabinet? Well, that'll be because they're cousins. So in this group that is supposed to be all about youthful rebellion, we have the two principal members with direct family ties to the British government. Just another example of this same dynamic that we see repeating itself over and over again. This is the manager of The Clash, Bernie Rhodes, and he was a stated situationist. This is another thing that the Sex Pistols have in common with The Clash. Malcolm McLaren was also into situationism. So the situationist movement came out of France, and it was a sort of intellectual, left-wing, anarchist movement. What's so curious about it is that the managers of the two most influential punk and new wave bands coming out of Britain were both into this particular movement, as was Tony Wilson of Factory Records in Manchester, behind the Hacienda nightclub, and Joy Division, New Order, and all these other groups, all to do with situationism. So this smacks of being another sort of mind control cult type operation. When it comes to punk and new wave bands coming out of America, a very prominent one was Talking Heads, and they had a side project called Tom Tom Club, which was comprised of the husband and wife duo Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth. So let's have a look at some family connections here. Tina Weymouth. Her brother Jan was a Harvard graduate. Of course he was. And he turns out to have been chief of design for the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei on the Grand Louvre project in Paris, involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid. The family's Masonic links seem to be represented here, given the symbolism incorporated into the Louvre and into one of the most Masonic cities on earth. Jan also designed the Salvador Dali Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and was awarded the National Order of Merit from France. Of course he was. How could he not? Jan and Tina's father, Ralph Weymouth, was a Vice Admiral for the US Navy. Stop me if you've heard this one before. And a Master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. Incidentally, the aforementioned Bob Marley's father was also a British naval officer, Norvell Sinclair Marley. So he had a black mother, but a white British father who also ran a slave plantation in Jamaica for a period. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to. And many people often ask me if I feel that the situation with Bob Marley is the same dynamic as what we have with Jim Morrison, in that Bob was pushing agendas and was effectively an actor. And I do feel differently about Bob Marley. I do personally feel that he was a genuine political activist. He was sincere in the messages that he put into his music, and that would be why there was an assassination attempt on him in 1976, with all fingers pointing towards the CIA having been behind it. Ultimately, it seems they did get to Bob and they knocked him off. He finally succumbed to a form of cancer. There's a long story connected to that. But again, all roads lead to the CIA and to the suggestion that Bob Marley was a genuine threat to the establishment. They didn't want him around and they had to get rid of him. So there's some good news for any Bob Marley fans in the house, right? I mean, it wasn't a happy ending for Bob, but at least we seem to have had one artist who, went against the grain. Just the one, mind. So here we are with Ralph Weymouth. His great-grandfather, or their great-grandfather, was Anatole Lebras, known as the Bard of Brittany, a highly regarded folklore poet and a lecturer at Harvard and Yale universities. Anatole married Mabel Davidson, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davidson, which brings a link to the Yale secret society Skull and Bones. Last month, incidentally, I was in New Haven giving a talk, and I got the opportunity to get a tour of the Yale University campus. And the guide made the mistake at one point of saying, "Have you got any questions?" And I was like, "Yes, I have a question. Can you tell me about the Skull and Bones secret society mystery school fraternity operating out of Yale?" And you know her answer? She said, "Oh, that's just a supper club. It's just for socialising. They just get together and, have dinner and have a chat every now and again." I doubt we could have expected any other answer to that question, really, officially, on the record. So Henry was a senior partner of the banking monolith JP Morgan, worked with the Astor Place Bank and was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, attending the notorious 1910 meeting of Jekyll Island. Meanwhile, Tina's a musician in a punk band. Yeah, right. And it's for this reason, because we find endless connections to admirals, to generals, to Harvard and Yale lecturers, to Freemasons, to representatives of bloodline families, to lieutenant colonels and spies, that I am one of these days going to put out a presentation to be titled "No One's Dad's a Plumber." Because when I first started researching rock bands, particularly, punk bands, heavy metal bands, I would have expected to have found the father's professions to have been things like plumbers, builders, electricians, plasterers, lorry drivers, bus drivers, dockers, these kinds of things, working class jobs. You don't find that. There's not a single plumber in sight. Plenty of generals, plenty of admirals, but no plumbers. So one of these days. Some of you may have heard me talk about the Copelands before, the Copeland family. I won't go over the full story right now, but suffice to say that if you were a band that was active in the punk and new wave scene in the 70s going into the 80s, and you wanted any level of success, you had to go through the Copelands. They were the appointed gatekeepers of that scene. Stuart Copeland, in the middle, of course, was the drummer with the group The Police, and they were called The Police because they were there to police all the other bands on the scene and make sure that only the approved ones slipped through the net. The Copelands, these three, who were active in the music industry, were the sons of Miles Axe Copeland, who was a long-time career CIA operative, a spy. There's another one. Two of the members of the Detroit 1960s proto-punk group MC5, Motor City 5, Wayne Kramer and Michael Davis, were inmates at the Federal Medicine Center in Lexington, Kentucky, which turns out to have been one of the CIA's principal MKUltra hospitals. So they're directly out of that program. We have all kinds of improbable stories coming out of the punk and new wave scene as well, so it seems no assets are ever put to waste. They're always used to put out a good story. So we're told that Debbie Harry of Blondie narrowly escaped becoming a victim of Ted Bundy right before he went on his serial killing spree. We can ask ourselves how plausible that story is, or whether it was simply used to reinforce a narrative using a familiar name, and we can factor into that Chrissie Hynde of The Pretenders, who says, The Pretenders, what's in a name? Who says that she was present at the 1970 so-called Kent State Massacre at Kent State University. This is where the National Guard opened fire on a group of students who were demonstrating on campus and killed a large number of them, shot 67 bullets, injuring 9 and killing 4. She says she was present at that event. What are the odds of celebrities being in place at all these major events? We can ask ourselves. Let's throw this one into the mix. The Lockerbie plane crash, winter solstice, 21st of December 1988. This Pan Am jet blew up mid-air and came down over the Scottish border town of Lockerbie, killing all on board. We're asked to believe that a bunch of famous people narrowly escaped death that day. Among them, the aforementioned Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, who claims that he was due to be on that flight. And the only reason he wasn't is because his wife spent so long packing that they missed their ride to the airport and had to book themselves onto a later flight. We're also told that the Four Tops, who were over in London to record an episode of Top of the Pops, overran with their performance and they missed their ride to the airport, thus cheating death by not being on that flight themselves. Then we have the actress Kim Cattrall of Sex and the City, and we're told that she spent so long shopping for a teapot at Harrods as a present for her mother that she missed being on that flight as well. Saved by a teapot. I feel that these stories are often used partly to mock us, again, because they see us all as ignorant and profane, and they think they can put stories out there like this, and most people will just swallow them without question. There's probably some occult, ritualistic significance to it as well, because these people are dark occultists, ultimately, at their core. But it's also just used to help reinforce certain agendas. And so into the mix we can throw what I term extracurricular activities. This goes hand in hand with lifetime actors, and it's what many of these famous people seem to do in their spare time, which tells us so much about them. Bono's a great example. He seems to have spent more time in recent years hanging out with the likes of Bill Gates and George Bush and Bill Clinton and the Pope, pushing various so-called globalist New World Order agendas, not least arms spear agendas. And then you have characters like will.i.am, or as I refer to him, Shill.I.am. Frontman of the Black Eyed Peas. So throughout most of his career, as it says here, a producer and a rapper, I use the term extremely loosely, he's been pushing ideas of transhumanism and artificial intelligence. That's what his output has been all about, glorifying electronic ways of doing things to a generation of young people and getting across the idea that transhumanism is really great, merging humanity with technology. What could possibly go wrong? To the point that he's been named Ambassador for Artificial Intelligence to the World Economic Forum. Here he is, hanging out up in Davos with Blofeld in the middle there. And Leonardo DiCaprio is up there. You know, he's been told to attend, so he's like, yes, sir, I'm there, sir. And so there's will.i.am hanging out with all the WEF cronies. Lifetime actor's work is never done, especially when you're a sir, I find. I've probably played you this one before, so I'll spare you this time round. But Sir Elton John, or Reg Dwight to give him his real name, pushing agendas. Yeah, we've seen that one before. Here's another Sir who features on the same ad. This was from a couple of years ago when they were really ramping up that old three-dart finish agenda. Sir Michael Caine. You don't get an acting career like this guy's, spanning multiple decades, without being completely beholden to the system and those that control it. The same dynamic that's in place for musicians is in place for famous actors. Also, famous alleged comedians and TV stars. So this was a particularly sickening one for me. When they were pushing out the arms spear agenda, it was noted that there was a very low take-up among certain demographics, notably the Black and Asian communities. Why might Black and Asian people be suspicious of white elite authorities, I wonder? I can't think. But for some reason, they just weren't jumping to the message that was being put out there. So it was felt that what was needed was a couple of ads specifically targeted towards those communities. So they wheeled out some Asian celebrities, the Goodness Gracious Me stars and such. And then they wheeled out a bunch of black celebrities, including, to her shame, Beverly Knight and Sir Lenny Henry. And so this ad was designed to try and increase the take-up among black people of what was being offered to them.
Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. Don't let your concerns be the thing that widens racial inequality in our society.
Don't let coronavirus cost even more black lives. Because we matter.
Two agendas for the price of one. Because we matter. Never miss the opportunity to throw a bit of extra social engineering in there. Then you have the likes of Sir Paul McCartney, or Sir Billy Shears, should we call him? If that's really him. Just some random dude in a beanie and a mask, not getting a shot in the arm. But we're told that's who it is. And he says, be cool, get vaxxed. Yeah, right. Then Mick Jagger, a lifetime actor's work is never done, hits out at anti-arms spearers. You can see how well I've trained myself through having lost 4 YouTube channels to not use certain phrases. It's just ingrained in me now. So, anti Britney, anti-Britney crew, you can't argue with these people, he says. And then Jeffrey Epstein had 301 Britons in his little black book, including Mick Jagger. Yeah, so we'll listen to him then, shall we? And what he has to say. Joni Mitchell and Neil Young will sidestep then for the moment and go back to so-called rap music. Contemporary agendas, what it's used for now. So this clown is known by the name of Young Thug. And here he is in the picture on the left, dressed up as Little Bo Peep in a dress. I remember rap and hip-hop culture in the 1990s. If a rapper had come out dressed up as Little Bo Peep in 1991, they would have been shot. Not saying it's right, I'm just saying it would have happened. But in the 2020s, no problem. It's embraced. It's even encouraged. When it's not that, it's the pushing of blatant satanic agendas. Satanism has gone mainstream. Here's Lil Wayne in the video to his song Love Me, where he says, "These hoes love me like Satan, man." And then he turns into a sort of demon with horns for no apparent reason. Lil Nas X, so-called rapper, brought out a shoe in association with Nike a few months ago, and it was said to contain real human blood. They marketed it in that way, got away with it. Another thing that George Carlin used to say is, nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. Satanism goes mainstream and nobody notices and nobody cares. Not to any degree that is going to make any kind of a difference anyway. And by the time you have a so-called rapper going by the name of New Age Jerk Boy putting out a song called Married to the Game, in which he's sporting rainbow-coloured hair in a white wedding dress, giving fellatio to a machine gun, all hope for humanity has been lost. The sad cat meme, that look you make when you realise all the personal heroes you used to look up to were just lifetime actors on the payroll all along. The Who, not Tedros's lot, Pete Townshend's lot, had a song, Won't Get Fooled Again. And this needs to become our mantra, because this song was about the dynamic of social engineering and how it gets done. That group knew a thing or two about it. So I guess what connects the material that I've presented here and everything I get into in my books and on my podcasts and such with everything else we're hearing about this weekend is breaking through lies and deception and lifetimes worth of them. So we have been lied to about everything. We've been misled about everything. Because those who, unfortunately, we've allowed to take control of organised society are psychopaths, they're Satanists, and they view the rest of us that aren't of their class with utter contempt. They seek to enslave us, they seek to control us, they seek to subjugate us, they seek to own us. And they get this done through many things, in many ways. Through health, through so-called medicine, through so-called science, through politics, through the mainstream media, and of course, through entertainment and popular culture. And the reason we attend events like this and get inside information like this is so that we can know better for next time. There's the well-worn phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, because we're supposed to learn from these things. And if there's any positivity at all in my talks, is there any positivity in my talks? I think there is somewhere. It's simply that we can now know these things. We have access to this information. If the will is there, we can do the research. The cat is out of the bag, probably this one, and it's not going back anytime soon. So there is optimism to be gleaned from the fact that We can simply know about these things, and where previous generations were caught under societal mind control and didn't stand a chance of breaking free of it, really, because they didn't have the internet, they didn't have the free flow exchange of information that we have, we do have that privilege. And so it does become a choice. We can choose to remain enslaved in ignorance, or we can choose to know better and make better decisions for ourselves. And when it comes to cultural heroes, simply the mantra, the resolve, in the words of the Stranglers, has to be no more heroes. And I would simply add to that, at all, ever. Thanks for listening.